The moment the bailiff called our case, my husband turned to me with a smirk stretched across his face and said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "No lawyer? You're really doing this alone?" He laughed, actually laughed, as if my life, our marriage, and everything I had built for the last 14 years was some kind of joke he was about to win without even trying. I sat there in my worn gray blazer, hands folded on the table in front of me, saying nothing, because I knew something he didn't. I knew what was inside the folder sitting beneath my palm, and I knew that in less than an hour, that laugh would be the last thing he ever mocked me for. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in second chances, if you believe that quiet people carry storms inside them that the world never sees coming, then please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one remind us that dignity doesn't need to be loud to be powerful, and our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe in kindness and justice again. Now let's step back, to where all of this began. My name is Marianne Holt, and for most of my adult life, I believed that love meant shrinking yourself so someone else could feel bigger. I was 39 years old on the day I sat in that courtroom, though I felt, in some ways, like I had aged an entire lifetime in the 2 years leading up to it. I had married Gregory Holt when I was 25, young and hopeful, working as a paralegal at a small firm in Ohio, dreaming of one day passing the bar exam myself. Gregory was charming back then, the kind of charming that made you feel like the only person in the room, the kind of charming that, looking back, should have warned me rather than comforted me. He was ambitious, handsome in a rugged sort of way, and utterly convincing. He told me I was the smartest woman he'd ever met, and for a while, I believed that meant something. We built a life together in a modest house on Wren Street, the kind of house with a crooked mailbox and a porch swing that creaked in the summer wind. We had 2 children, a son named Caleb and a daughter named Josephine, and for the first several years, our marriage felt like something worth writing about. Gregory worked his way up in a logistics company, and I put my own ambitions on hold, first for Caleb, then for Josephine, telling myself I would go back to school once the kids were older. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers when you're busy holding everyone else's world together, and before I knew it, a decade had passed, and my law degree remained a folder of old textbooks in the attic instead of a diploma on the wall. The cracks in our marriage didn't appear all at once. They came slowly, the way water erodes stone, so gradual you don't notice the damage until the shape of everything has changed. Gregory began staying late at the office more often. He began speaking to me with a kind of clipped irritation, as though my questions were burdens rather than conversations. He began comparing me, subtly at first, to other women, women who kept themselves up, women who had their own money, women who weren't just sitting at home. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the pressure of his job, the pressure of providing for a family of 4 on a single income, because by then, I had been out of the workforce for almost 12 years. I told myself a lot of things, because the alternative, admitting that the man I loved no longer respected me, was too heavy to carry. The day everything shattered started like any other Tuesday. I was folding laundry in our bedroom, half listening to Josephine practice piano downstairs, when I noticed Gregory's phone light up on the nightstand with a message that made my stomach drop to the floor. I wasn't the type of wife who searched through her husband's phone out of paranoia. In 14 years of marriage, I had never once done it. But this message was different. It appeared right there on the lock screen, no need to unlock anything, no need to invade any privacy, just 3 lines from a woman named Priya that spoke of dinner plans and a hotel and words too intimate for 2 people who were supposedly just colleagues. I sat down on the edge of our bed, the laundry basket forgotten, and I felt something inside me go very quiet, the way the air goes quiet right before a storm breaks. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I simply waited until that evening, after the children were asleep, and I asked him, calmly, who Priya was. Gregory's face went through several expressions in the span of a few seconds, surprise, then irritation, then something colder, something I hadn't seen before, a kind of contempt that made me feel small in a way I had never felt small before. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. Instead, he told me that I had let myself go, that I had stopped being interesting years ago, that a man needs a wife who spends her days folding laundry and driving carpools simply couldn't understand. He said all of this without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he had thought about it, rehearsed it, decided it was true long before I ever found that message. I would like to tell you that I fought back that night, that I found some fierce, unshakable strength and told him exactly what I thought of him. But the truth is messier than that. The truth is I cried. I cried in the bathroom with the fan running so the children wouldn't hear. I cried because 14 years of my life suddenly felt like sand slipping between my fingers, and I didn't know how to hold on to any of it. But somewhere in those tears, something else began to stir, something small and stubborn that I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the memory of who I used to be before I became only a wife and a mother, before I let my own name become an afterthought in my own story. In the weeks that followed, Gregory moved out, not out of guilt, but out of what he called clarity. He rented an apartment across town and began seeing Priya more openly, as though our marriage had simply been an inconvenient chapter he was now closing. He filed for divorce 3 months later, and that was when the true cruelty began, not in the affair itself, but in what came after. Gregory had always handled our finances. He had always been the one with access to our joint accounts, our investments, the paperwork for the house. When he filed, he did so with a lawyer, a sharp, expensive lawyer named Russell Hayne who specialized, Gregory proudly told me once at a mediation meeting, in protecting what a man has worked hard for. Gregory's petition painted me as a woman who had contributed nothing to our marriage financially, who deserved little more than a modest settlement, who should be grateful for whatever generosity the court decided to extend to me. He told our friends, our mutual acquaintances, even members of his own family, that I was difficult, that I had let myself go, that our marriage had failed because I had stopped trying. And the cruelest part was that some of them believed him, because Gregory had always been better at performing sympathy than I was at demanding fairness. I watched people who had known me for over a decade begin to look at me with a kind of pity that had judgment hidden underneath it, as though my silence in the face of his accusations was proof of my guilt rather than proof of my exhaustion. I could not afford a lawyer. That was the simple, humiliating truth of it. Gregory had controlled our finances so completely that when he moved out, he closed our joint accounts and left me with barely enough to cover groceries for the children. My parents had passed years earlier, and my sister, Colette, lived 3 states away, raising her own family on a nurse's salary, unable to offer more than emotional support over the phone. I applied for a public defender in the divorce proceedings, only to learn that family court didn't work that way, that unlike criminal cases, there was no guaranteed right to representation, that if I wanted a lawyer, would have to pay for one myself, and I simply couldn't. So I made a decision that terrified me more than anything else in my life. I decided I would represent myself. People who have never stood in a courtroom without someone beside them who knows the language of the law cannot understand what that decision costs a person. It isn't just intimidating, it's humiliating in ways that are hard to articulate. Every motion Gregory's lawyer filed felt like a foreign document written specifically to confuse me. Every court date felt like walking into an arena where everyone else had armor and I had only my own 2 hands. I spent nights after the children were asleep sitting at our kitchen table with library books on family law, highlighting passages, writing notes in the margins, teaching myself terms I had once studied briefly in college before life pulled me in another direction. I remembered, faintly, why I had wanted to become a lawyer in the first place, back when I was 22 and full of conviction that the law could be a tool for protecting people who had no other protection. I had let that dream go for my family. Now, ironically, it was the only thing that might save what remained of it. Caleb was 15 by then, old enough to sense the tension radiating through our house even when I tried to shield him from it. Josephine was 11, quieter about her worries, but I would catch her sometimes staring at the framed photographs on the hallway wall, family pictures from vacations that now felt like relics from another woman's life. I promised them both, in the only way a mother can promise something she isn't entirely sure she can deliver, that everything would be all right, that we would get through this together, that our family, though changed, was not broken. Gregory's lawyer filed motion after motion. They requested a full accounting of my spending, insinuated in court documents that I had been financially reckless, even though every dollar I had ever spent had gone toward our children or our household. They requested reduced spousal support on the grounds that I was capable of employment, despite having been out of the workforce for over a decade to raise our family. They painted a picture of me as an entitled woman looking for a handout rather than a partner who had sacrificed her own career so that Gregory could climb his. And through it all, Gregory sat beside his expensive lawyer with a look of quiet satisfaction, as though watching me flounder in a system I didn't fully understand was some kind of vindication for the marriage he had broken. There was one afternoon, about 4 months before the final hearing, when I nearly gave up entirely. I had missed a filing deadline because I misunderstood a procedural rule, and the judge, a stern but not unkind woman named Judge Adele Whitfield, had to explain to me, in front of Gregory and his lawyer, that my error had cost me an opportunity to submit additional evidence. Gregory didn't even try to hide his smile that day. I remember driving home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, pulling into our driveway, and sitting there for 20 minutes because I didn't trust myself to walk inside without breaking down in front of my children. That night, after Caleb and Josephine were asleep, I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and allowed myself, for the first time since the divorce began, to fully feel the weight of everything I had lost. My marriage. My sense of self. My confidence in my own capability. I cried until I had no tears left, and then, somewhere in that emptiness, something shifted. I realized that Gregory had spent our entire marriage teaching me, in small and quiet ways, that I was not capable, that I needed him, that without him I would be lost. And I realized, sitting on that cold kitchen floor, that if I gave up now, I would be proving him right, not because it was true, but because I had let his voice become louder in my head than my own. So I stood up, made myself a cup of tea, and went back to the stack of law books on the table. I decided that even if I lost this case, would not lose it because I stopped trying. I would not hand Gregory that satisfaction. What Gregory didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that I hadn't spent those months only reading library books. I had also been quietly, meticulously, gathering evidence. In the early days after he moved out, before the coldness fully set in, Gregory had made a critical mistake, the kind powerful people make when they've never been challenged before. He underestimated me. He assumed that because I had spent years out of the workforce, I had also lost the instincts that once made me a sharp, detail-oriented paralegal. He didn't realize that I had kept copies of financial documents over the years, not out of suspicion at first, but simply out of habit, the same habit that made me keep receipts and organize files. When the affair came to light and his true character began to reveal itself, I started looking at those documents differently. I discovered that Gregory had been transferring money into a separate account for over 3 years, money that should have been part of our joint marital assets, money he had been quietly siphoning away long before Priya ever entered the picture, likely for reasons that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with control. I discovered discrepancies in his reported income to the court, numbers that didn't match the pay stubs I remembered seeing years earlier, numbers that had been carefully adjusted to make it appear as though he earned less than he actually did, all in an effort to reduce what he might owe me in support. I found emails, saved not out of malice but out of the same instinctive organization that had once made me good at my job, emails between Gregory and a financial advisor discussing how to protect assets in the event of a divorce, dated nearly a year before he ever filed. I spent weeks cross-referencing these documents with what little I remembered from my paralegal training, staying up long after the children were asleep, teaching myself how to build a case the way I once helped attorneys build cases for other people. I reached out, carefully and quietly, to a former colleague from my paralegal days, a woman named Beatrice Sunwood who had gone on to become a licensed attorney herself. Beatrice couldn't represent me, she explained gently over coffee one afternoon, because she worked for a firm with a conflict of interest tied to Gregory's company. But she could, and did, spend hours with me on weekends, unpaid, teaching me how to organize my evidence, how to phrase my arguments, how to anticipate the tactics Gregory's lawyer might use against me. She told me something that stayed with me through every difficult night that followed: Marianne, the law doesn't care how expensive your lawyer's suit is. It cares about the truth, presented clearly. You know this material better than anyone in that courtroom, because you lived it and you documented it. Don't let his confidence fool you into thinking he has more power than you do. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late autumn, and I remember the sky that day was a pale, watery blue, the kind of sky that makes everything feel fragile and clear at the same time. I dropped Caleb and Josephine off at school that morning, and Josephine, in a moment of quiet wisdom well beyond her 11 years, hugged me tightly before getting out of the car and whispered, "You're going to be okay, Mom. You always figure things out." I held on to those words the entire drive to the courthouse, repeating them to myself like a small prayer. I arrived early, my folder of evidence organized with color-coded tabs, my notes written in careful, deliberate handwriting, my hands steady despite the storm raging quietly beneath my ribs. Gregory arrived 20 minutes later with Russell Hayne at his side, both of them dressed in tailored suits, both of them exuding the kind of easy confidence that comes from believing the outcome is already decided. Gregory glanced at my empty seat beside me, the seat where a lawyer should have been sitting, and that was when he made the comment that would haunt him for the rest of the proceeding, the comment I mentioned at the very beginning of this story. He looked at me, at my single folder resting on the table, at the absence of anyone beside me, and he laughed, that same cold laugh I had come to know so well in the final months of our marriage, and he said, "No lawyer? You're really doing this alone?" I said nothing. I simply opened my folder and waited. Judge Whitfield entered the courtroom shortly after, her expression as composed and unreadable as it had been throughout the entire process. She reviewed the preliminary matters efficiently, addressing custody arrangements for Caleb and Josephine first, arrangements that, thankfully, Gregory and I had largely agreed upon outside of court, both of us wanting, despite everything, what was best for our children. Then came the matter of financial settlement, spousal support, and division of marital assets, and this was where Russell Hayne rose to his feet with the smooth confidence of a man who had never lost a case he considered easy. He painted a picture of Gregory as a hardworking man who had provided faithfully for his family for 14 years, a man whose income, he argued, was more modest than typical for someone in his position due to recent company restructuring, a man who deserved to move forward from this marriage without excessive financial burden. He argued that I, having been out of the workforce for over a decade, should receive only limited, temporary support, enough to transition into employment, but nothing that reflected the lifestyle we had built together during the marriage. He suggested, delicately but unmistakably, that my years at home had been a choice rather than a sacrifice, implying that any financial hardship I now faced was a consequence of decisions I alone had made. I listened to every word, keeping my expression as calm as I could manage, though inside, something was building, not panic, but resolve. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, my hands trembling only slightly, and I began not with anger, but with facts. I explained, calmly and clearly, the sacrifices I had made for our family, sacrifices that were not simply personal choices but decisions made collaboratively, decisions that had directly enabled Gregory's career advancement over the years. I explained how I had managed our household finances in the early years of our marriage, how I had helped him prepare presentations for early job interviews, how I had put my own paralegal certification and law school aspirations on permanent hold so that he could pursue promotions that required frequent relocation and long hours, promotions I had celebrated alongside him even as my own dreams quietly gathered dust. Then I opened my folder, and I began presenting the evidence I had spent months gathering. I submitted copies of the financial transfers Gregory had made into a separate account over the previous 3 years, transfers that predated the affair and suggested a pattern of deliberate asset concealment. I submitted the emails between Gregory and his financial advisor discussing strategies to protect assets, emails dated nearly a year before he filed for divorce, evidence that directly contradicted his lawyer's characterization of a straightforward, amicable separation. I submitted pay stubs and tax documents that revealed discrepancies between his reported income to the court and his actual earnings, discrepancies that, I explained, appeared calculated rather than accidental. I watched Russell Haynes' confident expression falter for the first time since the hearing began. I watched Gregory shift uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier smirk replaced by something closer to alarm. Judge Whitfield reviewed each document carefully, her expression giving away nothing, but her pace slowing noticeably as she studied the financial records, cross-referencing dates, making notes of her own. The courtroom, which had felt so heavily tilted in Gregory's favor only 20 minutes earlier, suddenly felt like it was finding its balance. Russell Haynes attempted to object to several of the documents, arguing they had not been properly disclosed through formal discovery channels. But I had anticipated this, thanks to the long hours Beatrice had spent coaching me, and I calmly explained that these were documents I had lawfully possessed as a joint account holder and household record keeper throughout our marriage, not documents obtained through any improper means, simply documents I had organized and retained, as any diligent partner managing a household might do. Judge Whitfield overruled his objection, noting that the documents appeared properly sourced and directly relevant to the matter of marital asset division. Then came the moment I will remember for the rest of my life, the moment that gave this story its title, the moment when everything shifted so completely that the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Whitfield looked up from the documents in front of her, removed her reading glasses, and looked directly at Gregory. She told him, in the measured, deliberate tone of someone who had seen every kind of manipulation a courtroom could offer, that based on the evidence presented, it appeared he had engaged in a pattern of deliberate financial concealment designed to disadvantage his spouse during divorce proceedings, and that such conduct would be considered seriously in the court's final determination of asset division and support. She noted, with a precision that made Gregory visibly pale, that misrepresenting income to a family court was not merely a civil matter but could carry additional legal consequences if the pattern continued or if further discrepancies were discovered during a more thorough financial audit, an audit she was now inclined to order. I did not gloat. I did not smile the way Gregory had smiled at me only an hour earlier. I simply sat there, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet, steady sense of my own worth returning to me like blood flowing back into a limb that had gone numb. Gregory, for the first time in the entire proceeding, said nothing. Russell Haynes requested a brief recess to confer with his client, and Judge Whitfield granted it, though not before adding, almost as an afterthought, that she found it notable that the party who arrived without legal representation had presented the most thoroughly documented and legally sound case she had reviewed in recent memory. During the recess, I stepped outside the courtroom and sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, my hands finally allowing themselves to shake now that the tension of the moment had passed. I thought about all the nights I had spent hunched over library books, all the times I had wanted to give up, all the moments Gregory's voice in my head had told me I wasn't capable of this. And I thought about Beatrice, who had given up her weekends to help a woman she didn't owe anything to, simply because she believed that the law shouldn't only serve people who could afford it. I thought about Josephine's small, confident voice that morning, telling me I always figured things out. I allowed myself, for just a moment, to cry, not out of sadness, but out of something closer to relief, the exhausted relief of someone who had been carrying a weight for so long that setting even a fraction of it down felt like flying. When court resumed, Gregory's demeanor had changed entirely. Gone was the smug confidence, replaced by a kind of subdued tension that made him look, for the first time in years, uncertain of himself. Russell Haynes, to his credit as a professional, attempted to negotiate a more balanced settlement, recognizing that the evidence I had presented significantly weakened his client's position and risked exposing Gregory to further legal scrutiny if the case proceeded to a full financial audit. Judge Whitfield, after reviewing the additional arguments, ultimately ruled in a way that reflected fairness rather than punishment, though the fairness itself felt, after everything, like a profound victory. She ordered a more equitable division of marital assets, taking into account not only the financial concealment but also the true value of the non-financial contributions I had made throughout our marriage, contributions that had directly enabled Gregory's career success. She ordered spousal support that reflected the actual disparity in our earning capacities, support that would allow me the time and resources to complete the education I had once set aside, if I chose to pursue it. And she noted, in her closing remarks, that she hoped both parties would move forward from this proceeding with a renewed commitment to honesty, particularly for the sake of the two children whose well-being remained, ultimately, the most important matter before the court. As we gathered our things to leave, Gregory approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom, and for a moment, I braced myself for one final cruelty, one final attempt to diminish what had just happened. But instead, he stood there, looking smaller somehow than I had ever seen him look, and he said, quietly, that he hadn't expected this, that he hadn't expected me to fight this hard, that he had underestimated me. I told him, without anger, that he had underestimated me for years, that this was simply the first time it had cost him something. He didn't respond to that. He simply nodded, and for the first time since our marriage had begun to unravel, I saw something like genuine remorse flicker across his face, not enough to undo the damage he had caused, but enough to suggest that somewhere beneath the arrogance, a small part of him understood exactly what he had lost. The months that followed were not easy, because healing rarely follows the neat, satisfying timeline we wish it would. There were still difficult conversations about custody schedules, still awkward moments at Caleb's basketball games when Gregory and I had to sit near each other, still nights when the silence of our smaller, quieter house on Wren Street felt heavier than I expected. But there was also, for the first time in years, a sense of forward motion, a sense that I was building something rather than simply surviving something. I used part of the settlement, along with the confidence I had rediscovered in that courtroom, to finally enroll in the final coursework I needed to complete my law degree, something I had abandoned nearly 15 years earlier. I studied at the kitchen table where I had once studied library books on family law, except now Josephine sometimes sat across from me doing her own homework, and there was something deeply healing about that image, mother and daughter, heads bent over their studies, building their futures side by side. Caleb, who had watched the entire ordeal with the quiet, careful attention of a teenager trying to understand the adult world, told me one evening, almost shyly, that he was proud of me, that watching me stand up in that courtroom without anyone beside me had taught him something about resilience that he didn't think he could have learned any other way. Beatrice and I grew closer over that following year, and when I finally passed the remaining requirements to be admitted to the bar, nearly 2 decades after I first dreamed of that moment, she was the one who pinned the small brass scale pin to my blazer at the small ceremony my family and a handful of friends attended. I eventually joined a modest practice specializing in family law, drawn specifically to cases involving individuals who, like me, found themselves navigating divorce proceedings without adequate resources or representation. I couldn't take every case pro bono, of course, life still required practical income, but I made it a point, every year, to take on a certain number of clients who reminded me of myself sitting at that defense table with nothing but a folder and a refusal to give up. Gregory, for his part, seemed genuinely changed by the experience, though I remained cautiously guarded about how much of that change was authentic versus circumstantial. His relationship with Priya ended within the year, unsurprisingly, and though we never became friends in any traditional sense, we developed a functional, respectful co-parenting relationship that prioritized Caleb and Josephine above whatever bitterness remained between us. There were moments, watching him at school events or during holiday exchanges, where I could see him struggling with the weight of what he had lost, not just the marriage, but the version of himself he might have been if he had chosen honesty over control, partnership over dominance. I didn't take pleasure in his struggle, though I won't pretend I felt nothing at all watching a man who once laughed at my inadequacy slowly come to understand exactly how capable I had been all along. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it is this: the world will often try to convince you that you need permission, resources, or someone else's validation to fight for what is right. It will tell you that without the right connections, the right money, the right lawyer sitting beside you, you don't stand a chance. But dignity, truth, and preparation are their own kind of armor, quieter than confidence, but far more enduring. I walked into that courtroom with nothing but a folder and a refusal to be silenced, and I walked out having reclaimed not just a fair settlement, but the version of myself I had spent 14 years slowly losing. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll take a moment to answer honestly in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment in your life where everyone underestimated you, where you were told, directly or indirectly, that you weren't enough, only to prove, through quiet persistence rather than loud defiance, exactly how wrong they were? I would love to hear about that moment, because stories like yours are exactly why our community continues to grow, exactly why we keep sharing these journeys of hope, resilience, and second chances. Today, 3 years after that Thursday morning in Judge Whitfield's courtroom, I sit at my own small desk in a modest but meaningful law practice, surrounded by files of clients who remind me, every single day, why I refuse to give up. Caleb is now a senior in high school, applying to colleges with the same quiet determination he learned to admire in his mother. Josephine, now 14, has taken an interest in debate club, and I like to think some small part of that comes from watching me find my voice in a room that once seemed designed to silence it. Our house on Wren Street still has that crooked mailbox, still has that creaky porch swing, but it feels different now, lighter somehow, filled with a peace that was hard-won rather than simply given. I think often about that laugh, the one Gregory let loose in the courtroom that day, the laugh that assumed my silence meant weakness, that assumed my lack of a lawyer meant I had already lost. I think about how wrong that assumption was, not because I was secretly powerful all along, but because I chose, in the darkest, most uncertain months of my life, to become powerful, one library book, one late night, one small act of stubborn hope at a time. And I think, most of all, about every person out there right now sitting in their own version of that courtroom, facing their own version of that laugh, wondering if they have what it takes to fight for themselves without anyone standing beside them. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength or the strength of someone you love, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your thoughts, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about courage, forgiveness, and the quiet, unstoppable power of second chances. Our family, our community, grows stronger every single time we choose to believe that dignity doesn't need permission, that justice doesn't require applause, and that sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who ends up changing everything.